It's March news time. Not that many new releases worth taking note of, but we have upgraded Sellita movements on the way, new COSC standards of accuracy, one of the founders of Greubel Forsey leaves the business, JLC, Breitling, and the huge one, the one I'm spending the majority of my time on, the annual Morgan Stanley Watch report. I'm going to go big on this one this year, and I may even throw out some hot takes on who needs to shut down the factory and close up shop. So if you're new here, subscribe now. It's hugely appreciated. Really, it is. So thanks a ton if you do. And now let's dive in. Sellita are launching a new updated SW200, the SW200-2. It's got 65 hours of power reserve instead of the old 42. It's got more torque, which means it can likely be used as a base module to power other complications. It has an improved gear train for accuracy, reliability, and the long-term consistency of operation. There's also a new SW300 and an SW1000 on the way. This is huge for a whole lot of reasons. What we've been seeing for a lot of years is higher end brands like Omega, well, not so much Omega, but Rolex, Tudor, Glashütte, refining and upgrading their movements with better accuracy, more power reserve, and better anti-magnetic properties. The distance from those luxury brands' movements and down to the movements you typically saw in the entry and midpoint brands has grown. But with this Sellita, it gives the entry, micro, and independent brands an opportunity to close that gap by buying into the new Sellita movements. This means you'll be getting even better specs in that $1,000 to $4,000 space. These movements will cost more than the old SW200 and 300 movements, and that will also translate into higher MSRPs for the watches, but it will still be a value movement offering. So just consider this. You'll now have a Sellita movement in the highest grade that will be fully COSC certifiable, and with a few tweaks, it'll probably also be super COSC certifiable with a power reserve that's the same or better than some Omega coaxial movements. So if you just disregard the sort of technical prowess of the coaxial movement, on the pure base specs, if you're presented as a non-informed customer with 55 hours of power reserve for an Omega and 65 hours in some other brand, 65 hours is going to sound like more because it is more. This is also big because it tells me there is still good business in providing value to the value space. There are manufacturers that want better movements for their value-focused watch products. Not everything is going high-end and luxury, and this is just fabulous for the value-orientated buyer. I think I heard a rumor about this new level of COSC certification from an insider about a year ago, and now it's finally here. This new COSC standard is stricter than the old standard, which had an accepted deviance of 10 seconds, which is now down to a new deviance of 6 seconds. They've also built in a new level of anti-magnetic testing, specifically 200 Gauss, plus a verification that the power reserve stated is the one that is consistently delivered. For those of you that are not in the know, there is an actual certification market where COSC and Metas are the most well-known Swiss players. Several manufacturers like Rolex have their own in-house certification. This new COSC standard isn't class leading, but it's still excellent. And more importantly, it reflects to me a standard of what you should reasonably be able to expect from a mid to high-end luxury watch these days. If you're paying anywhere between $4,000 and $15,000 for a watch, I think it's reasonable with new materials and new movement technologies that you should be able, as a manufacturer, to achieve an accuracy of -2 to +4 seconds, that you can trust the actual power reserve, and that you get a decent level of guaranteed anti-magnetic resistance. Some people are likely going to point out the fact that 200 Gauss anti-magnetic range isn't really that high in a world where Omega and Metas test for several thousand Gauss. And to that I say, a MagSafe iPhone charger puts out around 50 Gauss consistently. A fridge magnet might get you all the way to 100 Gauss. The reality is people are exposed to a lot of magnets these days, but the vast majority don't get above 100 Gauss. 15,000 Gauss is bragging rights, and it has no real world relevance. Except, of course, for you. You know who you are. You are preparing to write in the comments that you own the world's largest collection of neodymium magnets. You sleep in an MRI machine. When you go to the airport, you insist on lying on the conveyor belt and going through the scanner together with your luggage. For you, yes, I admit it, 200 Gauss is not going to be enough for you. Sticking with the heavy business stuff, Breitling's private equity owners slashed the valuation of Breitling in their latest reports. This both doesn't mean anything, but it does mean something. Quick recap on private equity, the simplified version. Private equity is basically companies whose business is to buy other companies and then sell them again for a profit. Private equity used to be a money machine because you could buy companies dirt cheap, and because interest rates were low. That's important because private equity rarely only pays cash. They loan money to finance part of the purchase, and then they try to sell before the loan is due. That's in large part why private equity often wants to offload a company in 4 to 7 years or faster. These days, private equity isn't as profitable as it has been. That's because interest rates are higher and because of simple supply and demand economics. Private equity has just had to pay more and more to acquire companies, so the really sweet deals have become harder and harder to come by. Now, for Breitling, they have been under 2 private equity ownerships totaling around 10, 11 years. That's more than 4 to 7 years. For private equity, this means at a minimum that the return on investment that they were hoping for isn't going to be as big as they originally planned. In the private equity space, the PE firms are required every year to assess the value of their holdings. PE valuations are model-based estimates using assumptions about growth, profitability, and market multiples. These assumptions involve a level of judgment, but they are constrained by accounting rules and audit scrutiny. But think of it this way. As a private person, you've got insurance. You have some expensive watches, and the insurance company wants to know what the value of those watches is. If you price the value of your watches high, you're going to pay a higher premium on your insurance. If you price them low, you're going to pay a lower premium, but you do risk not getting a full return if all your watches are stolen. So, to some extent, you make up a number that fits. PE, within the regulatory constraints, make up a number as well. And it doesn't really matter while they're just holding on to the equity. Except if you lower your valuation, you are doing 2 things. You're telling the market that you own something that isn't as valuable as you thought. Since you've bought this thing through loans, a bank might want to raise your interest rate in anticipation that you won't be able to sell it off for the same kind of profit as you had hoped. That's not going to have an impact on your current loans, but it might become a consideration if the loans need to be refinanced, which might be an issue because of the longer period of PE holding on to the asset. You're also telling the market that the company you own isn't as valuable as you thought. The reason Breitling has been devalued is basically because of the overall decline in the watch market and the fact that Breitling has spent a lot of money on building boutiques and new movements and relaunching Universal Genève and relaunching and acquiring Calais. Breitling has been spending a lot more money, but has not been making as much money as they'd hoped for. They're not necessarily going bankrupt, but they're not living up to their own expectations. The thing I would pay attention to is this. When does private equity lose patience with George Kern's strategy? George Kern might be doing the best job in the world, but if the outside market is on a downturn, it's not going to make a difference. And if private equity loses patience, you'll see Breitling starting to cut back aggressively on ambitions. Private equity is notoriously ruthless in terms of changing direction if things aren't moving the way they want them to. I'd expect that employees at Breitling would start to feel the screws being tightened on the day-to-day because of this. This is, of course, with the caveat that Partners Group, which is the company that holds Breitling, are known for having longer holding periods than other PE firms. For them, 4 to 7 years isn't as hard a stop as it might have been if it had been EQT or Advent or Bain Capital. I also have to talk about the fact that one of the founders of Greubel Forsey left the business. Greubel Forsey make in the range of 100-200 watches a year. The average price is in the vicinity of $500,000 per watch. Some of their watches are as close to handmade as you can possibly get. So why did he leave? Nobody knows for sure, but I'll tell you what has happened over the last couple of years at Greubel Forsey. A couple of years back, just before COVID, rich people noticed them and they started doing well, selling those 100-ish watches. They saw this success and they got ambitious. A new CEO had a genius idea. He said, what if we didn't sell 100 watches, but instead sold 500 watches? And the team loved this idea. But then he said, but we're going to sell them at half the price. And the team didn't like that idea. But then he said, but if we multiply 500 by 250,000, that number is going to be bigger, we like bigger, than the old price for 500 times 100. And the team liked that idea. Then he went on and said, if we're going to do this, we have to build a big, beautiful factory and buy some big, beautiful machines. The building also has to be big and beautiful. I'm guessing that there was some reluctance in the team, but they went along with it in the end. And how was this not going to be a success? This was the exact strategy that Bremont had also pursued, and we all know how successful that was. Much like the captain of the Titanic, the CEO proclaimed, full steam ahead, and screw the icebergs. Needless to say, this harebrained idea turned out to be a mistake. A brand like Greubel Forsey should not be building everything themselves. A brand like Greubel Forsey should not have a giant glass and aluminum flagship studio. They did not and do not have the scale to have such an extensive operation, and the unrivaled stupidity of any brand thinking, hey, let's sacrifice our scarcity and high prices for broader availability and lower prices, is just so mind-blowingly stupid. So I'm usually very aware that I'm not an expert, and I am not an expert. I do my best to be humble about these things. I've never proclaimed to be an expert because I'm not. I'm a nerd who's got a hobby, but I do believe I could have done better at CEOing than this numbnut. So now Greubel Forsey are in trouble. There's some kind of infighting and disagreement, and some people are jumping ship. And not only are they jumping ship, they've completely abandoned that old strategy. Which brings me to the Morgan Stanley report. What's interesting about the Morgan Stanley 2025 or 2026, the latest one, report? First of all, Swatch Group wrote a letter to Morgan Stanley basically saying your numbers suck. You can read the full letter on Swatch's website. The main point is that Swatch Group feels the numbers are wildly inconsistent. I've myself been following the report for some years, and on a brand level, I do tend to agree with Swatch Group. I've less and less come to trust the individual moves that the reports indicate. Average sale prices can vary wildly from year to year, and so can volumes. What I do trust, though, is the high-level analyses that they do, because they align with the analyses that come out of other sources like Deloitte and retailers and market analysts and stuff like that. So what high-level points do I think we can largely trust and use as a starting point for the conversation? One, volumes continue to go down overall. This is verified by multiple sources. The world is buying fewer and fewer luxury Swiss watches. Even Rolex potentially sold fewer watches last year. Two, there's a concentration going on with the brands that I've started to call the shadow brands, because they cast such a big shadow over all their competitors, have continued to consolidate, and in effect, they cast an even bigger shadow. And this is brands like Rolex, Cartier, Patek, AP, and Richard Mille. Three, in a world of decline, some of the biggest leaps seem to be still in the value space. Now, whether or not we trust the numbers completely, Frédéric Constant, Raymond Weil, Christopher Ward all grew, and those brands have individually said they've done really, really well for themselves. I think this is notable because none of them have been aiming for luxury customers. They are squarely in the sub-luxury value space from $1,000 to $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, space at their highest end in steel, excluding, one or two special complications. What it tells me is that if you offer something that is perceived as good and of good value, there are still customers out there in the overall sea of decline. 4, since there's a consolidation around a few bigger names, the more peripheral brands are likely down. I do think it's reasonable to say that Hublot is probably down. Breguet is probably down. And the big story is a very clear, consistent and long-term trend of Omega continually declining. Here, I think it's relevant to bring up that Swatch Group letter again, because you have to pay attention to what they don't say in that letter. Among other things, they took issue with the statement that Longines were not profitable. And they said Longines is profitable, but they didn't take issue with Longines declining. Swatch Group also stated that the Morgan Stanley data was so inaccurate on average that it could mean that Omega were either second or sixth on the list. But, and this is really important, they made no attempt to explain where Omega actually were. They did not refute that Omega had apparently declined. Swatch Group chose to call out the inaccuracy of the Morgan Stanley report's numbers. I tend to agree with that general call out. But in the Swatch Group letter, they tried to come with as many positive examples as possible, but they never really refuted the negatives. Especially the one on Omega stood out. They at no point tried to make a statement that Omega had been profitable or had grown or was still class leading. To me, this just serves to underscore what market analysts also believe, that Swatch Group is in a difficult spot, and that's why the stock continues to underperform. The last 6 months have seen an improvement, but they are still far below their record high, which was set in 2014. And now I'm going to talk about who needs to radically change as a company. But first, an economics lesson. A very simple one, because I'm not an economist. 2 things you need to know is this. The world's population is growing. Globally, people are getting richer. If you're in the US or Europe, you might not feel that growth in disposable income, but globally, more people are. What this means for a product like washing machines is there will be more customers over time for washing machines because every household needs a washing machine. But this doesn't apply in quite the same way to watches because nobody needs a watch anymore. There was a time when a watch was something that was needed. Now it isn't. Your phone tells the time. Your Apple Watch can do more. A watch is jewelry. And more importantly, it's a status signifier. People still want to signal status. So the question is, wouldn't that mean that since more people are getting rich, that there's a growing market for watches? Unfortunately not. And why not? Because depending on the country and the culture and the age and the demographic and the gender of the customer, the status signifiers are going to be different. Just take your average humble CEO making, a paltry $100 million a year, or your regular tech billionaire next door. For Mark Zuckerberg, he was bored one day and then he spent $30 million on the most inaccessible luxury watches in the world. But Elon didn't, Tim Cook doesn't, Bill Gates doesn't. Many wear an Apple Watch. For others, their Garmin signals status because it shows that they're rich and have time to be fit. This applies to non-CEOs as well. For young people, a pair of $3,000 Bang & Olufsen headphones are also a status signifier. Where you go on vacation is a status signifier. Watches are competing with a whole lot of other luxury items as status and wealth signifiers. And all things being equal, because this isn't an inevitability, watches are becoming a less prevalent way to signal status. The overall trend is towards fewer luxury watches being sold globally. So what does this mean for watch brands? The first thing I did was just look at the way their lineups are set up, the consistency of their messaging, and I also categorized them according to whether they were doing a great job, a good job, an okay job, or a terrible job. It's not just based on the Morgan Stanley report. This is a synthesis of my own opinion and how I read what is said about them through other credible resources. You are free to disagree. This is more of a conceptual roadmap. So on the screen is my sort of take on who's doing great, good, okay, and terrible. Then, and I've spoken about this a couple of times now, so I'll do this quickly, the industry has 3 problems. The crowd problem, the name problem, and the shadow problem. The crowd means there are too many players. The name problem is that it's hard to differentiate on quality, so brand recognition ends up being the deciding factor. And then there's the shadow problem, which is the key one here. Some brands are just so big that they cast a shadow on everybody else. If you want a piece of the pie as some other brand, you have 2 options. You can be more like the other shadow brands and risk being perceived as generic, unoriginal, or just not as good. Or you can be different from the shadow brands and shadow products and risk being perceived as too quirky, too weird, and too niche. So my next question was down to 3 options. Is your brand a shadow brand? Yes or no? Should it be? And is it realistic to aspire to becoming a shadow brand? The interesting thing here is not necessarily whether my desktop back of an envelope assessment of one particular brand is completely accurate. Maybe you think Lange should aspire to be a shadow brand. Maybe some of you believe that they already are one of those shadow brands. For me, the framework is more illustrative of a couple of emerging strategies that should guide these businesses. Group 1 is the defend and consolidate strategy. This is for brands that are shadow brands. They have a dominant position and are fundamentally very well in control of how they're running their businesses. What they need to do is defend their position. They do not need to focus on massive volume growth, but instead need to manage inventories tightly, drive up average spend, and overall maintain their dominant positioning. Group 2, these, unsurprisingly, are brands outside of the high-tier luxury space. This is still a place where it's a volume game to some extent. And although the overall market is shrinking, there's still an opportunity to take shares from other players. Here, there's no clear dominant shadow player. It's not Longines, it's not Tudor, and it's definitely not Frédéric Constant. There's also no player that is doing such an excellent job on the product side that they outcompete all the others consistently. Point being, there's room to try and take the shadow position. This is the grow and seek domination category. It's Longines, it's Tudor, it's Breitling maybe, it's Frédéric Constant. Some are going to lose, but this is what they should be doing. They should be aggressively trying to take market share and expand and take space from the others. Group 3 is the differentiators. MB&F shouldn't be aiming to double or triple their production. Greubel Forsey should not aim to sell 5 times as many watches at half the price. Moser should not be aiming for a doubling of output. They should also not strategically be thinking of themselves as competing with shadow brands like Patek. These brands have a niche, they are clearly differentiated from the shadow brands, and they have proved that there's a customer base for this differentiated niche. They should defend it and develop it within the limitations of that niche. In a lot of respects, they should be doing the same as the shadow brands, but with the clear awareness that they at no point try to be like or to compare themselves or to associate themselves with the shadow brands. It's their differentiation that makes them relevant. The moment they seek to go towards the middle, they lose. Group 4 is the reconfiguration strategy. It's Breguet, it's Swatch, it's Blancpain. These are the brands that I think are fundamentally doing something wrong. And they are at a minimum not doing a good enough job on the product side, while also they have a volume and a scale or both problem that doesn't fit demand. So I've read interviews of the Breguet CEO that almost always says that they are producing to their capacity. It's his polite way of saying we're selling what we hope to sell. But looking at their secondary prices, they drop like a ton of bricks. And that's why I do believe that Breguet should be reducing output while raising price. I think that would be a viable strategy for them. I also said in my video about a year back, they need to be smaller, much more niche, and much more expensive. Zenith also, I'm not sure they should exist, but the strategy of being this mix of mainstream, retro, and Hublot light is not a sustainable approach. They need to reconfigure. Now, could they move to becoming a movement supplier more broadly, like they were intended to originally when they entered the conglomerate that they're in? Potentially. That would also be a legitimate strategic alternative. What is likely not sustainable is their current size and output. I think the same applies to the likes of JLC. They shouldn't be trying to sniff at the toes of Patek. They need to reconfigure and find their niche and stop behaving as if they're the fourth wheel in the Holy Trinity. Finally, there's one last strategic option, and there's only one brand in it. This strategy is the Get Your SH1T Together strategy, and it applies to Omega. The Swatch Group letter didn't change my assessment. They did nothing to convince me that Omega are knocking it out of the park as a business. There's nothing that tells me that other brands should give up the fight for top-of-mind recognition with Rolex. Rolex needs competition. And no, that doesn't mean Omega should price everything like Rolex. They should be cheaper, but they so need to get their product positioning and lineup together. Their design language, their marketing. There's so much potential in this brand and the industry would benefit from Omega being better, not just at a product level, because they do regularly release nice watches, but at a structural, organizational, messaging and positioning level, they just don't. The thing that's going on right now is all brands strategically are either chasing growing their volumes or growing their prices. Those might be perfectly reasonable outcomes of a strategy, but I don't think that they are in and of themselves meaningful strategies. There are 5 option spaces as I see them, but realistically, because of the shadow dynamic, which option space you land in strategically is almost a given. JLC should not and can't aim to become a shadow brand. As long as they try, they'll fail. Zenith will also fail as long as they chase anything remotely looking like a growth strategy. And as long as Omega is so all over the place. As long as they continue to allow their intern to throw ideas at a wall, they will continue to not claim the position that they should rightfully be taking. The clarity of focus needed for them to compete needs to return. Those are my thoughts. Share your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.